Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for being at the presentation of my project, which I entitled Multiplicities and Mutualities, brought to you by this white void, which is a nod to John Oliver. If any of you watch that show, he's my boyfriend. Just kidding, only in my imagination. So most of you know that I've worked in the field of social problems for the last 20 years. I began with crisis intervention, and then I started moving more towards the world of how do we prevent some of these problems. In addition, I've been a maker of objects. These objects have been informed by my experiences as a community worker, but not necessarily connected to it. They're divergent. So we have this like professional Heather, and then this like Heather who wants to have eyeballs sewn to her, and the two Heathers have been separate. So I came to SBA to investigate like how I might create a space to blend these two worlds. And I knew I wanted to focus on inequality as a social problem, even though it's a bit broad, because it comes up constantly in my work, whether I'm working on violence or mental health or addiction, it's always correlated. And also because the work that I do, there's always group decision-making processes and community prioritization of populations and resource allocation. So it's always there. Another reason is that the government does not fund a truly deep investigation into structural inequality, not surprisingly. There's no grant a community can apply for to really deep dive into this issue. So I really wanted to use the tools that I've learned for the last 20 years as a public employee in a way that the government would never fund, but also to serve back to the public, to be of service to the public. So that's sort of where I started. One useful model that I've learned in thinking about any given social problem, and this really works for any issue that you are trying to think about, is to think of this problem as a tree. And it really helps to figure out where your piece of the work can be and where you're orienting yourself, because these problems are always really complex. So if we think of inequality as a tree, then all of the various isms that we know, like racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia or whatever, are like its various poisonous fruits. And these fruits are really different, but they're all connected to in important ways. And some people concentrate their work, and sometimes I do too, around focusing on like these individual fruits, and that's really important work. And it's not always appropriate for me to do every aspect of all of that work. But at the same time, we know if we want to kill the tree, we don't just like pick off all the fruit. We have to kill the roots. And so in my work, that's really kind of where I like to focus, is this idea of like what's underneath these issues. And so even when you sort of get inside here and you're like, and you've already like decided, okay, I'm going to focus myself down here, but there's a lot to think about even down here. And so part of what I usually do is I help communities like organize these different root causes and to think about them. So we think about like, what are the attitudes around this issue? What are the norms? Like, what are the practices and the policies and the laws, and how are those laws being like enforced? And are things resourced, equally and equitably, and many, many other factors. And so the way, obviously you can't do everything. No one person can do everything. So what I like to try to do is to think about one root cause that may be really strong or that comes up a lot, and just to see if I can like get a hold of it and just start to pull on it. And then to see if I can get other people to pull on it and to tug on it a little bit as like a method of subversion and sort of just beginning to upend this system. So it doesn't seem to matter what community that I'm working in or what issue I'm talking about. Like one root cause that comes up all the time is this idea of lack of skills. And so why lack of skills? Well, I think like we might all have people in our lives, or we might think we can identify people who are like pretty dug in and invested and benefiting from their racism and their sexism and their xenophobia and their homophobia. And we might just be at this point where it's like, cannot even with this person. And maybe that's completely valid in some cases. But I'm really more interested in the rest of us who value equality and just jack it up all the time in our relationships or with our leadership, or like for those of us who want it, but we're still trying to figure out like, what does this mean in a given situation? Like I sort of understood what this meant in this situation at work. I don't really understand what this means in my relationship. I'm interested in what happens after everyone goes home from the protest and tries to figure out how to actually put into practice something like equality or something that they've assigned value to. And I'm also interested in how we keep like a movement for some specific form of inequality from resembling the structure of the very thing we were sort of trying to dismantle. So this notion of like, now the pigs are walking around on two legs again, you know? So in this vein, I set up 6 art practices in 6 different relational contexts, because I think culture begins with the self and then it expands outwards into all the segments that we have influence in. And also noting that we have to be willing to be influenced by those spheres of relation that we're in. So all of these practices really related back in some way to this idea of multiplicities and mutualities. And the reason for that, which I wrote about, but I'll just summarize very succinctly here, is that we're in relation. No matter what we do, we're in relation. And this relation always produces conflict. And our colonized instincts tell us to address this conflict through domination or through maintaining some sense of power and control. But the antithesis of this is really to navigate the conditions of multiplicities and mutualities, or more simply to say we're different, and that difference is our biggest power, and it's also our biggest challenge. And we have to resolve this because we're connected, our fates are connected. So when I came to SBA, I wanted to think about how to sort of use art as a method of activism more. And so I read a lot of different theorists. I still feel like I have so much more to learn, but I've learned a lot. And I figured out a couple of things that this project was not necessarily focused on. So like my goal was not to make collaborative art, even though I did do that at times, that wasn't the underlying theme so much. And then second thing I realized were, okay, this is not exactly what I'm trying to do, is to try to situate like some moment of social interaction as the art object, even though I also did that at times as well. Particularly, I'm thinking about the practice I did with the school around conversation. But even though that occurred, that wasn't really the underlying point. For me, the underlying point was to, like, the theorist that I found helpful was Marchart, and that's because he helped me connect this idea of practice with building skills. And the reason is he said that art can function as these warm-ups. So just like the way you would do like 1,000 pliés at the bar, you don't even know what choreographed dance that's going to be for. That's how art practice can function. And these practices can form the foundation of some sort of social or political reality that's not yet in existence. So I started off with the idea of making a website. I knew I wanted to exhibit my project, whatever it was, in the form of a website, because it felt really nihilistic to me to make work for physical space, not knowing what that would be, and I need a mission. So I couldn't get my head into that. So what I did was I started with this idea of a website, and I knew certain things like that I would create this installation, this virtual installation. And so I made this tablecloth and did all these different performances of cooking, and I kind of knew I would situate them in this context so it could be viewed virtually. But as I went, I also figured out that this website became a really useful place for me, because it just became a repository of all the just the different investigations I did. I did around this year. So I came to see this website as a quilt, and just kind of a mashup of the different, I mean, I went really wide and more than deep, because it was just like, I wanted to throw a bunch of things against the wall and see what happens. And I just really wanted to play with a lot of things. And so this website for me became like a quilt and a mashup of like the interviews that I did and the art objects that I made and performance and documentation of that performance and the collaborative storytelling and all of those things. So I really enjoyed the process of creating this. I'll just go really quickly. I'm not going to go into detail on every project because I know you all have been able to view it, but I'll just kind of state how each one relates to the theme. And then I thought I would just highlight a couple of areas. So this project was where I started with myself and did this practice of imagination in order to stay connected to this idea of organizing around difference, despite like the fact that as you grow, that gets complicated. And despite that, like there's a lot of historical failures with that. So that's sort of the goal of that one. This practice that I did in my family with cooperative gaming related to multiplicities and mutualities because it was about leveraging difference towards a common goal. And then I did this practice on my street. This was my only one that involved non-human species and non-human neighbors. This one really became about multiplicities and mutuality because it connected to relating to an other, even through opacity, and this idea that you don't have to understand something in order to take risks with it or to relate to it. And it also sort of became about questioning borders. The practice I did with my friends explored multiplicities and mutualities because it allowed people to break out of what Glissant calls this identitarian machine, like these notions of identity that are convenient for the capitalist or the colonizer, but not really nuanced enough to serve our purposes. And then with an organization, I worked with Oklahoma City Public Schools, which is our state's largest district. And this addressed multiplicities and mutualities by really just trying to build connection through listening and empathy, regardless of whether you agree with the person. And then lastly, I worked with my dance community, which truly is a community. I'm connected to people even internationally, even online and in different cities that I go to because of our connection to dance. And this was really just about challenging this machine that builds gender and reducing fear of fluidity of gender and also like fluidity of transferring power. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. I wanted to talk maybe about a couple of key ways that I think my work is changing in the program. So this image has been really inspirational to me, not because like I particularly like Tiffany's or anything, but I use it a lot in my public work because to teach communities about messaging, because in this one image, you know an entire story. And that's what I think is brilliant about this image. Like, you know, I guess if you're from this culture, but you know where these characters have been, you know, where they're going, and you know how the story ends. And so I just think that's really interesting and really challenging to do. And in my own work, I've always liked the challenge of how much information can I get into a single image, but through the use of maybe more positioning materiality to bring information to the work. Like this piece I did our first summer. And it's not as on the nose as like the Tiffany's ad, and it asks more of the viewer, but I think it's also a little less manipulative. And then here's another one that like has had a lot of resonance when I've shared it with people in studio visits. But this is, you know, if you know this is a quilt, I hope it's aesthetically interesting, but if you know it's a quilt of my outlet calendar, then you start to understand the juxtaposition of these two very repetitive and pattern types of labor, but one is paid and one is unpaid. And so hoping to invite the viewer to start asking the same questions I am, even if like this story doesn't have an end or such a directed conclusion. But when I started coming to SVA, like that very first summer, we worked with Eleanor Tipping. And I'd never done performance work. And she gave us this word, gesture. Hang on, let me share my screen like I thought I was. There we go. She gave us this word, gesture, when she asked us to think about performance. And so now I'm not just thinking about what physical materials hold the most information. I'm thinking a lot about what gestures convey the most information. And so this was kind of a first attempt. And at times, you know, I'm sure it is clumsy, but I've really started thinking through like what gestures can I do and juxtapose them with Orwell's text as like to answer his invitation to imagine different outcomes and just to retain simple desires for workers. So that was kind of the basis of that. And then also like I was thinking about gesture in this piece I did with the game, which I really, because of my interview with Matt, who created this game Pandemic, I really started to understand these games as stories that we tell with each other. And so instead of just sewing, I started thinking about this gesture of sewing and unsewing these stories, and also another gesture of sort of like singing this apocalyptic lullaby while there's all this chaos around. So again, just like a really early attempt for me, but an attempt to do something different. And then with this nature project, I already knew because of my community work that you kind of have to meet people where they are. And so I live on a street with 5 houses. And every single person, it just so happens right now, has a lot going on. So I just did something really simple. And then for myself, I went more maybe in depth and did this whole like raising of the wasp and like trying to relate and trying to communicate with this wasp, which I have to say is something that I would have done before I came here. But this program, I feel like, gave me the tools to situate this as part of my practice. I thought a lot about Haraway's notion of making kin, maybe not in quite the same way, but it just is a phrase that came up a lot for me. And then from the very first semester, I remember Laura had us read Kamnitzer, and he talked about how art is meta to science and that it's both propositional and interventionist at the same time. And I thought about that a lot, and it was just really freeing for me to get to do what I wanted to do in a way. Because obviously, like, the state is not going to pay me to raise wasps with my community. So, it was freeing to have this time to kind of just explore. And then there's so many things I learned, but I just wanted to highlight one last thing. When we worked with Ernesto, he talked a lot about, like, you have to really think about what gifts you're giving people because you're asking them to participate. So when I did this practice with the school, I thought about their time, which is very limited, especially this year. And it's always, but I knew they had this focus on equity. So I tried to gear the prompt to something that would be helpful to them. And that's why we did this prompt around belonging, because in my research on equity, so I could be of use to them, I found out that diversity is part of equity, but you can really make a policy around diversity because it's a numbers game. And inclusion, I mean, that's a box you can check. But belonging is like in the sauce. You can't make a rule. It's just a thing we do. It's a way that we make our culture. And so that was one gift. And then the second gift, because they're so busy, I just gave them, because they were vulnerable with me. And after they shared this thing, I just gave them this 1 minute to breathe, which I really don't think they get much of. And I just gave them this meditation where they could maybe have a moment before they went back, especially after hopping on the Zoom in between classes or whatever. So let's stop sharing. Yeah, I mean, this is all a first chapter. I have so much more I wanted to do. I really had so much more I wanted to do with dance, but I had to get a little creative because of COVID. But it's a start. And so I just appreciate everyone's help and advice in this journey. And I'll just leave it for questions.